I'm going to go back to this map in just a minute. This has some relevance. But let me start out by, so how many people in this room are really familiar with redlining? So pretty much everyone knows what it is. Well, when you think of redlining, you probably don't think of Seattle as being a really big hub of segregation during this time. Well, in the early 20th century, at the height of Jim Crow until the late 1970s, banks would refuse to lend would-be home buyers who lived within areas to be at poor financial risk. These areas were often literally marked on maps with red lines labeled hazardous, which is the red marking you saw on the map previously. Most of these undesirable areas were occupied by people of color, and the bank's unwillingness to loan to them because of this redlining practice meant that they remained segregated. So, and this is going to go on to explain this map, and then I'll go back to it, and it'll probably make a little more sense. In 1936, Seattle developers mapped out the city by dividing Seattle according to the race, class, and wealth of each neighborhood. There were 4 classifications. Best, which was green, this was areas where banks were likely to approve a loan. These areas were defined as having residents of the highest class of professional men. In other words, this was upper class white folks lived here. This included areas like Mount Baker Park, Carlton Park, and Montlake Terrace. Still desirable, which was marked in blue, banks would still likely approve from this area. It was mostly middle class whites that lived here, and it included areas like Piney Ridge, Winona Park, Finney, Ballard, Green Lake, Wallingford, University District, Queen Anne, and Magnolia. Definitely declining, which was yellow. You're kind of running into territory where you might not be so fortunate. This was where low-income whites lived. It was a little harder to get a loan, but it was possible. Hazardous, which was red, these were the only areas African Americans and people of color could live in Seattle during this time. These areas were too risky for banks to lend. So people of color were often confined here. This included areas like International District, Central District. These were the hazard zones, and any person who moved out of these hazard zones and into a green or yellow zone, well, that could mean that that entire neighborhood would be red zone. So now I'm going to back up a little bit here, and I'll move my head out of the way. Right here, as you can see here, these areas in red, which if you look at that map right there, you can see there's quite still a strong correlation. Still today, a lot of African Americans still live in these areas, like the Central District here, in these areas.
Yeah, it's really close.
Yeah. Up here, this is where most of the wealthy white folks live. So this is Montlake Terrace. A little bit. Montlake Terrace.
No, Montlake.
Montlake, yes.
Montlake. Okay.
Montlake. That's Montlake.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Montlake Terrace.
No, Montlake Terrace is the city up in some other. It's just Montlake.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
I want
the
to make
terrace
sure.
house,
Right,
that's a
yeah.
different city.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem. No problem.
Tongue-tied
We
today.
just want to
Pretty
clarify.
white,
But anyways, so this map, although clearly, redlining is now illegal, as you can see, if you look over to where Ann is standing, it had quite an effect on where minorities live today. So, and this is going to get, and so now we're going to go into the part where Ann was talking about racial governance. So, fearing that letting a person of color or Jewish person move into the neighborhood, and which could theoretically lower property values and cause the neighborhood to be red zone, white property owners and developers inserted covenants that restricted those with African American, Native American, Asian, Jewish, and non-white blood from occupying the properties. Now, this was technically illegal and was ruled so in 1948. However, this did not stop until the 1960s when it was officially banned by the city. And down here a little bit, these are old newspaper clippings of when this was happening. And right here, probably can't see it too well. But the gist of right here, this was a letter from a homeowners association alerting the neighbors that an elderly black woman had moved into the neighborhood, and if they wanted to save the sanctity of their neighborhood, they had best put some racial restrictions on, so no more Negroes, and yes, it does use the word Negroes can move in. And during 1927, after a 3-year campaign led by Capitol Hill Community Club, homeowners in Capitol Hill and Queen Anne rallied their neighbors to sign on to the racial covenants exclusively targeting African Americans in the presence of a notary. So white homeowners rallied their neighbors and went from house to house with the notary, kind of scaring them to sign on. And a lot of the tactics was they would use, they would scare their neighbors into saying that if they allowed African Americans to move in, their property values would decrease, crime would move into the neighborhood. And this was quite successful in some reasons. For instance, Capitol Hill, this was the most successful effort. And in 1928 to 1931, it had spread to areas of Queen Anne, Montlake, and Madrona. Now, Capitol Hill was probably the best example of this, and 928 white homeowners had signed on to these covenants exclusively targeting African Americans or anyone who was non-white from living in the entire region, and that included, I believe, about 90 blocks. So that had basically walled off all of Capitol Hill from non-white residents. And so I've included a little bit of, this is the language that was once in deeds, and some deeds still hold this language, although it has no legal power anymore. Some have already been struck out by homeowners. Lake Forest Park, Chittenden Terrace, which is right there and pointing a little tiny little dot.
Kind of along the south boundary.
It's where I live.
Yeah, well, no, it's actually just north. It's, you didn't quite make it.
So Larry's neighborhood, for instance, or close to Larry's neighborhood, if we were to take a time machine and travel back about 50, 60 years ago, this would have been written in all the deeds in the area. And it says, no person except of the Caucasian race shall ever be permitted to own or occupy said premises or reside thereon, except the capacity of a domestic servant.
So that includes spouses. That includes children. You're not allowed to have your spouse reside in your house if they're not Caucasian.
Unless they're your hired help.
Yes.
I've heard rumors that there's stuff like this also in some of the documents that they have over in the Richmond Beach area.
Yes.
I actually know people who said that it's still hidden. It's hidden in all these insidious.
In 2006, Innis Arden finally removed the racist
heard
covenants
about
from
that, yeah.
their homeowners association documents, even though it had been illegal since 68, 69.
It was
But
still hidden in there.
really, until 1967, this was legal all over the city of Seattle.
I know.
Well, it was still
Shocking.
going on in 74.
They're still going on, is right.
Yes.
So there's a few more, so I'm just gonna kind of read off a few of these. So Shoreline, in Bollinger, it's the same thing, no race or nationality other than those of the white race or Caucasian race shall use or occupy and dwelling on any lot except this covenant shall not prevent occupation. So basically, if you're not white, you cannot live or occupy this area unless you are in the capacity of a servant. Lake City in Seattle, on Lake Washington, they specifically targeted African, Japanese, Chinese, or any of the Mongolian descent. Capitol Hill, which was what I was talking about, this is the Capitol Hill Covenant, which was the most successful covenant, which was entirely organized by white homeowners through their homeowners association at the time. And what this specifically says is no part of the lands owned by him or described following their signatures of this instrument shall ever be used or occupied by or sold, conveyed, leased, rented, or given to Negroes or any person of a Negro blood. This one was very specifically targeting African Americans, and this stayed, even though it was illegal in 1948, this stayed in place until well into the 1960s. And in Magnolia, Queen Anne, Magnolia and Queen Anne were two places that also saw a lot of activism by angry white homeowners to organize. And this is going into the 1960s is when people finally started fighting back and realizing that this was not acceptable and became successful in that. And I kind of, before I want to go into this, I want to really point to, these are two propaganda pieces. This is a Vote No, the open housing campaign that would have eliminated covenants and segregation. And this is a Vote Yes. So these are two opposing propaganda pieces, for and against. Now, if you look closely at the Your Rights Are at Stake criminal record Vote No, it looks awfully familiar, right, to some campaigns you've probably seen in the last 10 or 15 years. Despite the Shelley versus Kramer ruling was what made it illegal, even though this continued on until at least 1968. The open housing campaign was when Seattle residents began to realize how awful this was and began to really rally successfully around getting it removed. And it was about 10 years, 1959 to 1968. And the arguments against open housing, which you can see here in some of the propaganda pieces, was that it would raise property taxes while devaluing property value and would force whites to give up their equal rights and liberties.
Equal rights.
Alicia, do we have any information about how often any of this was enforced after the 48 decision?
So from what I've looked at, it's kind of sporadic and it depends on the strength of the covenants, because Capitol Hill, for instance, that was enforced well into the late 1960s. There are some places, I think Magnolia was one, where somewhere into the mid-1950s it began falling apart just because homeowners began realizing that this really was not acceptable. So it really does vary by region. Capitol Hill was one unfortunate case of racism that this took quite a lot of organizing to get that removed. And what ultimately removed it was the city voting unanimously to outlaw it and making it effective immediately.
It's interesting how it's not always where you think it is, because let me tell you, I live in Magnolia and it's pretty lily white.
Yeah.
And Capitol Hill, of course, is quite diverse, at least now. And it's interesting to me that Magnolia was a leader in that. I'm glad, but you could have fooled me.
And I'm also looking at like the Sheridan Beach, Sheridan Heights area on the census here, and it's not until the 2010 census that it gets above 0.2%
Right.
in the racially covenanted census tract.
This may be
Yes,
obvious, but when they had the covenants, did the banks enforce the covenants by saying they wouldn't give mortgages to those that were in the covenants, that were prohibited?
So
The
realtors did that.
yeah, so
Yeah.
the realtors and developers were typically the ones who were, if they would slip these racial covenants in, because they figured the more that they could keep minorities out, the more valuable the property will be, because it won't be redlined. Now, Capitol Hill was kind of one of the cases where it actually was a little bit reversed. It wasn't so much the developers, it was the white residents. But I would say in most cases it was the developers and the real estate agents that slipped that in, and white homeowners just didn't question that for decades.
In Lake Forest Park, it was from the time that the development was platted. So these were developments that were intentionally designed to prevent any non-Caucasian from ever owning property in the entire platted area.
It was 1968 was the year that Seattle City Council unanimously passed the Open Housing Act after the 11 years of lobbying by residents, which made it effective immediately, which not coincidentally was the same year Congress also passed the Fair Housing Act, which would have made all acts of housing discrimination illegal anyways. So it was quite a while, from from the 1920s all the way up until 1968, and Seattle still had problems with redlining up until 1975. It wasn't until 1968 that the covenants were finally able to get struck out. And this is another piece of it, but it's equally as important, and this really plays into the whole battle we're having in Seattle right now today. So, single-family zoning did not exist in Seattle until 1923. Before that, we had a building code. This dictated not just building size, but how land within a neighborhood was allowed to be used. The intent was partly to create a space between where people lived in commercial and industrial operation, in part racial exclusion. St. Louis architect Harlan Bartholomew was the champion of a newly introduced single-family zoning concept. For his 1919 St. Louis zoning project, he stated that the goal was to preserve the most desirable neighborhoods and to prevent movement into finer residential districts by colored people. And he was hired as a consultant in 1923 for Seattle's zoning plan, which incorporated his ideas into our zoning. And this is where it ties into where we're having all these problems today. 75% of Seattle right now is zoned for single-family use. Oops, let me go back here. So how it was before is quite different. After the zoning plan, it was divided into districts. First, residential districts allowed single-family homes as well as churches, parks, libraries, schools, and rail stations, but banned the multifamily dwellings that had largely been unrestricted in the building code days. These structures were restricted to second residential districts, which covered about 35% of the city. Now today, 75% of Seattle is zoned for single-family use, which is a big chunk of Seattle. And this is where, okay.
Just as a parallel development, in 1909, the city of Lake Forest Park was being promoted by Ole Hansen as a residential community that would have a strictly defined town center where you could have commercial development, and everything else would be single-family residential. So I can't help but hear that in the context of competition from developments like Lake Forest Park that were saying, businessmen, come out to our lovely sylvan forested community where it will all be single-family residential on large lots. You don't have to worry about having something like Capitol Hill happen in your neighborhood. And that was actually the language used in the promotions.
Okay.
The east side.
The effects of what this had on homeownership by race and ethnicity, this is what it is as of 2016. 51% of homeowners in Seattle right now are white. Only 24% are African American. So this is where the Seattle zoning battle comes into play. Last year, the Seattle Planning Commission released their Housing Affordability and Living Agenda, HALA, which some of you may already be familiar with. It's been making quite buzz in the news lately. After researching Seattle's current housing and affordability crisis, they found that cities exclusionary and racist zoning coupled with redlining and racial covenants were partly to blame. And these are the recommendations, which unfortunately has caused quite an uproar among some white homeowners. They proposed passing legislation that would bring change to single-family zones, allowing large single-family homes to be subdivided into smaller units, placing size limits on new home construction to limit the spread of McMansions. You've probably seen them sitting on by Lake Washington, and allowing development of duplexes, triplexes, small apartment buildings, and other multi-family rental housing. So this was what Seattle looked like before before the rezone that they did with the family housing in the 1920s. Currently, they have not made much of any progress because of opposition from homeowners in Wallingford, Ballard, Capitol Hill, East Lake, Queen Anne, Green Lake, Ballard, and all of the places that were originally covenant only. So this is, if you're wondering why Seattle is such a mess and why we have a housing crisis, well, this is part of the reason why.
Yeah.
And 70% of homeowners in Seattle are white, and most minorities are renters. And I'm just gonna leave this last part because this is the effect of about 100 years of redlining. The median income of the homeowner as of 2016 was at least $65,000 more than that of a renter. So this graph here, this is the end result. And this is one of the reasons why Seattle wants to upzone some of the neighborhoods. And there's more information on the back if you wanna go into a deep dive. Liz will be
Deep dive.
including this in the PowerPoint, so if you want an even more depressing deep dive into our
I
history.
just want an action item.
Here you are.
I know, let's do it.
What are some action items, Lisa?
Yep, support.
What are some action items? I would definitely, I will have to do some, a little bit of research, but one of the things I would suggest would be, the next, and I'll look this up, the next time Seattle has a, community hearing in your neighborhood about zoning. I know that they have had some in Queen Anne and Capitol Hill and Ballard, attend and perhaps bring a little history with you.
I think it's happening in Lake Forest Park right now.
Oh, yes, and Lake Forest Park.
Just saying.
Yes, it is.
So if you would really
Action
like an
item.
action item, contact Ann.
You know, Larry and I attended the Lake Forest Park discussion of the draft environmental impact statement for more dense housing redevelopment in Towns Hall. And most of the people who attended were utterly opposed to any dense housing in the town
Yep.
center. And they wanted it to be converted into a green space playground for their children.
Yeah, there's there were emails that went out. I live in Shoreline, Lake Forest Park area, and I got some emails from people who were like, we don't want this in our community, and I was like, ooh, it kind of gave me a little bit of that uh-oh feeling. So there are action items around this. We need to really investigate where those actions can be, and my rule of thumb right now with the state legislature is go to the state legislature and just do some keyword searches and see if there's anything happening in the state legislature, because a lot of the stuff gets, like, just like it got hidden in those covenants, this stuff gets buried and hidden in all these other places. So I would do a keyword search and find out if there's anything that at the state level, and then also find out what's happening in your communities, because this stuff is happening for real.
This is city council stuff too. We're all gonna have city council races this fall. This is city council stuff. They're the people who make a lot of these decisions.
Okay, I know we're a little pressed for time, but I
Just
know
real quickly,
that.
elections is trying to monitor some housing affordability legislation coming through the legislature, so look at Larry's KP.
Okay.
And I think this is the beginning of an awareness that we should all be aware of this, and as you find opportunities for meetings and everything, let's make each other aware and make this one of our priorities as a group.